Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Today, I couldn't help it. I know last week was a solo episode. I've got another solo episode for you today, and it's because there's been so much news over the last week. And one of the things that I want to start doing is demonstrating how the level of our polarization is causing us to be trapped in a game. And this game is one in which the polarizers, the dividers, the conflict entrepreneurs play on our instincts. And I want to utilize and show the tactics that people use to polarize us in key moments in stories. And the three stories we have for you today are, one is obviously you've heard President Raisi of Iran passed away in a helicopter crash. I want to talk a little bit about that story. The second is, I'm sure you've seen the Chiefs field goal kicker, Harrison Butker, and the commencement address he made. I want to talk a little bit about the fallout of that and what that shows and highlights in this sort of outrage industrial complex moment that we live in. And the third is, obviously, you may have heard President Trump and President Biden have agreed to a debate with CNN in late June. And I want to touch on some of the nuances I'm seeing in that coverage to, again, show you and uncover the ways in which we're being polarized and divided. But before that, before we get into the monologue, I just want to acknowledge that today's Memorial Day. And today is a day that I think is one of, if not the most important days for me on the calendar of the year. And the reason for that is because 3 years ago, I started this tradition where I would visit the local military cemetery here in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. And I remember making this post after visiting that cemetery that basically said something along the lines of, I want to just take a moment to reflect on, honor the sacrifice of the brave men and women that have given up their lives so that we could live the lives that we're currently living today. And someone had reached out to me. I forget the exact note here, but they had said something that really changed the way I thought about today. And importantly, it forced me to ask a question. And that question is, how am I living? It's a question I reflect on a day like today. How am I living? Here's what they shared with me. They said, Manu, I appreciate you sharing the sentiment that, you honor and want to remember the sacrifice of the brave men and women of the armed forces of the United States. And that's important. But are you asking yourself the question, are you actually living a life that is worthy of that sacrifice? And in the moment, I didn't have a good answer to that question because I had really never thought of it like that. And as a civilian that has deep respect for the military, for the sacrifice, for the fact that we get to live a life, you and I get to live a life free, where we can actually hear each other, where we can listen to each other, where we can listen to this podcast, we should be asking ourselves that question, how are we living? Because I think on a day like today, we have to not only remember, but uphold and recall that all of us, every generation of Americans, are stewards of an awesome, ambitious experiment. We have a somber and solemn responsibility to steward this experiment for the next generations. And that people before us, we stand on some tall, tall shoulders. People before us gave up their lives in defense of this experiment, of this country, of this democracy. And what really drives me, and I think what probably drives you listening to this, is a deep concern for the place that we are in our country today. And part of the reason why I do this work, part of the reason why I started this podcast, reason why we're building Bridge USA, is because I want to do everything I can in my power, in the small piece of the puzzle that I occupy, in the smallest of ways, to just make sure that I'm doing my best so that this experiment not only continues but thrives, so that our democracy thrives. And that's why I care about this work so much. And that's why I think on a day like today, it's important to be introspective, to ask ourselves the hard questions, to be critical, because I think that's how we honor. And so with that, and there's no easy transition for this, but I just wanted to mention that because today is a very important day. Let's get into the monologue and let's discuss these three news stories, because I think the way in which our politics is trending is not one that is worthy of sacrifice. And importantly, it requires us to get our act together, to figure out how we build the next chapter in our democracy, in our country, so that all of our voices can not only be heard, but so that we can push this experiment forward for generations afterwards. Let's get into it. So, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, the three stories we have today that I want to demonstrate and show to articulate the outrage industrial complex that we live in. But not just that, but I think it's important for us as listeners to see the polarizing tactics that people use, because it feels like sometimes we're just pawns in a game. And that, in fact, while yes, we should have very divided issues, and yes, we care about really strong beliefs, my entire point for showing these polarizing tactics is for you to be able to not only opt out of the system, but to recognize that the calls for us to bring people together, the calls for us to try to address polarization is not just for some kumbaya sense, but it's so that we can actually build a system in which things work. Because right now, polarization has set up a game between blue and red that's locked into a spiraling division that goes nowhere. So the three stories: President Raisi of Iran, his passing away in the helicopter crash; Harrison Butker's commencement at Benedictine College; and President Trump and Biden's debates that is coming up. What are the three stories? What do they show us? First, President Raisi's passing away in the helicopter crash. So I don't know if you're like me, but when a major news event like this happens, I remember waking up the morning and I saw Iranian state television saying, hard landing, President Raisi injured and missing, along with the defense minister. And I went, oh my God, this is a big event. I immediately went online and I went to X. Maybe that's my first problem, but I went to X, and I know many of you do for your news, even if you don't admit it. I went on and I could not figure out what was going on, because the tweets I was seeing, all the messages I was saying, it was all outrageous, sensational stuff. I just wanted the darn news story where I could get the facts and figure out why this happened, what's going on, what are the implications. That's all I wanted to know. And instead, I'll show you. Here's the first tweet I saw that day. It's 6.6 million views now. I won't talk about the Twitter account because I don't want to amplify them. But it says, I wonder what happened to the president of Iran's helicopter. Interesting how the other two choppers made it safely and only his crashed. And then it has an image of a of a fighter jet with a laser pointing down at a helicopter. The point I'm trying to make is that because we live in an incredibly polarized time where outrage sells, and we talked about this in the last episode, where we live in an economy that focuses on attention and trafficking in attention, not nuance, you get people that immediately take a news story and their first reaction is, how do I gin up more attraction and influence? How do I get all these people riled up? How do I say the crazy thing that's in my mind that you and I might also think of? Honestly, I'll be honest, I thought, what if there's foul play involved here? It's not an unfair thing to think about. But let me actually share that with the rest of the world. And let me complicate the narrative. This also happened with the Baltimore bridge collapse, where that ship crashed into the pillar of the bridge and it led to that tragic collapse in Baltimore. We talked about a similar thing. Because we live at this moment, we follow our influencers, and our influencers are driven by a set of incentive structures where what they're going to say is they're going to say the stuff that oftentimes might not necessarily be accurate or even in a pursuit of truth, but is just their immediate knee-jerk reaction to an event. And so now imagine this. Put yourself in the shoes of an influencer, right? You put out this thing. What if an American jet with a laser destroyed the aircraft? Or let's say it was Mossad, right? That was another thing we saw going around. And I know that most people don't take these things seriously, right? And let's say they were true. They warrant inspection. They warrant further discussion. But the information economy that we live in, where I'm an influencer, I'm sitting here, you're an influencer, and you put yourselves in shoes. Imagine you just put out something and then millions of people's views were shaped by that. Because we're living in a moment where we're not training ourselves to be information literate. So we have to wade through all of this chaff of info to actually get to the real thing. And the fact is, most of us don't have the time to read 18 different tweets to figure out the nuance and complexity of a story. And so the reason why we got to address our polarization is because it's creating the conditions for us to be swamped with outrage, swamped with sensationalism. And then what gets lost is what actually happened. And now, here's the other problem. Because a lot of people think different things happened with a story like this, how are you going to create policy? How are you going to create a unified stance? What's the forward-looking vision going to be? Because now people are going to say, well, this happened or this happened, and that's going to shape their views on the next steps of this news story. You see what goes on? You see what I mean? Here's second story. Harrison Butker's commencement address at this Catholic conservative college. Now, you've probably seen what he said. He talked about how the ultimate responsibility of a woman is essentially to be a homemaker. That was his view. Some of you might deeply disagree with that view, and I understand that. Some of you might agree with that view. I understand why that could be the case. But here's what happened the moment that speech went viral. First of all, the fact that a commencement address of a Kansas City Chiefs field goal kicker at a college that is relatively small went viral in and of itself speaks to the craziness of the moment we live in. In fact, it went viral right during some of the biggest stories around Trump's trials and Iran's president passing away in a helicopter crash. But amidst these two stories, we're going to focus on the field goal kicker's commencement address. So let's just put away the humor of that, right? Which, oh man. Anyway, so you look at the immediate reaction to his comments, to his views. And the immediate story is, should we cancel Harrison Butker? Should the NFL cancel him? In fact, the White House press secretary got asked a question by the press reporters saying, will you invite Harrison Butker or the Chiefs to your White House visit? So now you can already see the dividing lines are, should Harrison Butker be canceled or not? And you see this happen a lot with controversy. Immediately jumps to cancellation. Immediately jumps to is this person a bad person or not? And then the Twitter influencers and the social media influencers descend on us. And similar to what I just talked about in this last story with President Raisi, you have information dump, and then simply because we as people don't have time, we sort into our groups, and it's red and blue. What is my red guy saying? What is my blue person saying? I'm going to follow that person. You know what gets lost in all of this? The most important thing, in my opinion, an actual discussion of Harrison Butker's views. And not only that, but no one's asking the question, why? Well, why does he believe what he believes? Maybe we should try to understand that. What are his life experiences? Maybe we should try to understand that, as a conservative evangelical, religious faith person of faith, maybe he's got his own perspectives. And why would I say it's important for us to have that discussion? Because if we actually cared, if the cancellation crowds and the crowds that are opposing this cancellation actually cared about what happens in our country, and if they actually cared about us having a real exchange of ideas, and if they actually were genuinely outraged about what he said, well, let's have a discussion about why he believes those things. Because if we want to live in a world in which we solve our most complex challenges, if we want to live in a world where we figure out how people of faith and people of not of faith, of people that have certain views and people that have opposing views actually live together, not only live together, but build and experiment and build upon a moment where we can actually solve our problems, well, that's gone. Instead, if you turn on Fox News, where there's an attack on faith, and if you turn on MSNBC, it's the NFL's got to cancel Harrison Butker because we live in a patriarchy. And again, there might be granolas of truth in both of those things, and you might agree with one of those things a little bit more than the other. That's fine. My point is that we're getting to a point where we focus less on the actual ideas and substance of people's perspectives, and we focus more on the performance that happens around their views. And when we keep trafficking that economy, you're going to arrive at a moment where people are not sharing their views, they're not sharing their beliefs, we're not having a discussion, which is the cornerstone, shall I remind you, of a democracy. And instead, you just have the outrage industrial complex spinning out content. And you know who wins? Not us, not the people, the influencers. The influencers win. Story number 3. I'm sure you've heard. President Trump, President Biden, they've negotiated with CNN. They've cut out the presidential commission debates, and they want a debate to happen. And they're probably going to have this debate. End of June, I think. Mid to late June, around that time. Anyway, you might agree on this debate happening. You might disagree with the debate happening. Here's my point on this story. When I tried to understand, and again, I did my little Twitter searches, I did my Google searches, I even used ChatGPT, believe it or not, to figure out, well, what's actually this news story about? Let me try to understand the information. Here's what I got. I got liberal influencers talking about how this will be a strategic win for Biden because it will enable him to try to flip the narrative that he might be losing to President Trump right now, and that it might be an opportunity for him to shift the election to Trump. That's the view that I'm getting. And when I go to the conservative channels, the view I get is, well, this is an opportunity for President Trump to expose the senile behavior of an aging president. Now, this is an opportunity for him to flip the polls and focus on and highlight just the ineptitude of President Biden. You know what's missing in both of those perspectives? Oh, I don't know. Well, what about the actual issues that these people are running on? What are their policies? Will this debate allow us to actually have a real constructive debate and discussion where we could actually understand President Trump's stance on immigration, President Biden's vision for the economy? No. What? Manu, that's a really naive perspective. Why? How could you possibly request that? How could we as the American people that decide that want to vote on issues, right? That want our problems to be resolved, that want to see things like inflation go down, that want to be able to figure out how, you know, these president's policies affect our policy outcomes. No. Here's what we're going to see. And again, this is the point. We're in a game. We live in a game, a political game, and it's easy for them to be in this game. It's easy for President Biden and President Trump right now because it's simple. Divide and then you fight over 3% of the public. That's their strategy. And they think that this debate will get us there. And maybe we've always lived in a political game. Sure. But you know what'd be really nice? It'd be really nice to know what President Biden's vision is for America. It'd be really nice to know what President Trump thinks he's going to do differently in his first 100 days as president. The point of all of this is that we live in this distortion reality, this outrage industrial complex, where our ability to be divided allows these people in power, the influencer class, the social media elite, the news agencies, to operate in a very simple binary world. Yes, no, cancel or no cancel, red or blue, you're right, I'm wrong, evil, good. That's it. And do you know how easy it is to make money off of that? I share all of this on a day like today, where I know, again, I know we're missing the conversation, the interviews. That's usually what happens at the show. But a day like today, where we are thinking about whether or not we're building a country and whether or not we're living lives that honor the sacrifice of the men and women of our armed services who fought to defend the freedom for us to say and sit, in, for example, in front of a microphone and share my perspectives. On a day like today, we have to be asking whether or not we're building a system, whether or not we're living our lives, whether or not we're doing things in a way that actually is in the best interest of our country and its people. And the only way we get there is by figuring out how we not only reduce our polarization, but see the commonality in each other's views and perspectives to complicate that binary of good, bad, red, blue, yes, no, cancel or don't cancel. Because if we can do that, then what happens is we can flip the equation. President Raisi's passing in the helicopter crash, that news story, Harrison Butker and his commencement address, and the Trump-Biden debates that are coming up. All three of these stories, I want to exploit and demonstrate the polarizing tactics that people are using in real time, because it's important for us to stand watch and be on the lookout for those things. We have to empower ourselves. It's time to opt out. It's time to opt out of the game because there's more important things at stake. And us in the hopeful majority are building a small piece of the puzzle that'll enable us to opt out. I appreciate you listening. If you're new to this show, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, usually we have great conversations with guests. But again, I'm going crazy with all this information that's coming our way, and I wanted to just break it down for you. And importantly, if you're an old and past listener, thank you so much for your support. We're building this together, you and I. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Leave a review on Spotify and Apple. And I want to wish everybody a really happy Memorial Day. See you next week.